All right, well, thank you very much, everybody, for being here today on our inaugural conversation series, installment of a conversation series that Lexington Books and Rowman and Littlefield is sponsoring for the Anthropology of Tourism, Heritage, Mobility, and Society book series. I'm Michael DiGiovine. I'm an associate professor of anthropology and the director of our Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology at Westchester University. I'm the current convener of the Anthropology of Tourism interest group at the American Anthropological Association, and I am the series editor of Lexington Books' Anthropology of Tourism, Heritage, Mobility, and Society book series. Just a very brief word, the Anthropology of Tourism book series, for those of you who are interested, it provides anthropologists, but not just anthropologists, anybody in the social sciences and humanities with cutting edge and engaging research on the cultures of tourism. You don't have to be an anthropologist to publish with us, but you of course have to share and embrace our anthropology's holistic and comprehensive approach to scholarship, and be sensitive to the complex diversity of human expression. And we have now in our short time, we have 13 books in the series with a number more on the way. I can just show, very nice, pretty one. And of course, today we're dealing with this one, The Ethnography of Tourism, Edward M. Bruner and Beyond. And I'm so thrilled, yes, and we all have the book. I'm so thrilled to have the editors and so many of you here with us today. Two housekeeping announcements. The first one is that this is the first in a series of conversations that we're going to have with other book authors and editors. We have 6 more lined up for the year. The most recent one that's going to come up is on October 19th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Angela Domovich will be talking about Bourbon Street bee drinking and the sexual economy of tourism. It's a fantastic book, an excellent monograph, and that's going to be followed up by a very nice interdisciplinary book on tourism and wellness, Travel for the Good of All, also on October 28th, which is just so relevant for today's COVID era. So what we are going to be doing very briefly to give kind of the overview here is for the next half hour or so, we'll have a conversation between the panelists that you see here. They're all the editors of the book. And then we'll open it up to questions. So for the Q&A, because of the technology and how it's working, for the Q&A, if the audience can see, you have 3 buttons underneath. One is a Q&A button. Anytime during the talk here, feel free to type in a question that you'd like us to address, or that you would like to ask yourself in the Q&A section. When we get to that section, Alex and I will call on you. We need to make you a panelist so that you'll pop up, your face will pop up like ours. So hopefully you're wearing pants. I am this time, so it's okay. And you can ask the question, and then we'll kind of bring you back into the ether. After that, at around 12:30, we want to hold a special memorialization of Edward Brunner, about whom the book was written. Ed actually, unfortunately, passed away exactly 1 month ago today. That his wife, Cookie, said to me, maybe that's very auspicious that we're holding it by chance. And I know that he's here. I had spoken to him a couple days before. We were going to hold the original one. He was so happy to see this book in print. He's so happy that we were doing this event. So thank you all for being here. When we get to that point, I'll mention it again, but what you'll do is you'll have that hand raise button, and just press it and keep that little icon raised if you want to say a few words about Ed then at that time, and we'll go down the list. We'll make sure that everybody who wants to talk and say a few words about Ed can do. And if you have to leave, but you want us to read something, you can always send it to me in a private chat, or to Alex Salazar, who's going to be helping us out with this. Okay, does that make sense? All right. So thank you all for being here. I'm really thrilled, actually, that this is the first book that we're doing in the series, because I think it's one, in many ways, it's an instant classic. It's a very comprehensive book, and it talks about ethnography of tourism and somebody's, and Ed Brunner, a particular person's influence, great influence on not only the ethnography of tourism, but on anthropology and ethnography in general. So I wanted to, I forgot to introduce you guys, but I want to start with Naomi Leite. You could say, everybody messes my name up. Naomi Leite. We've been friends for a very long time. Naomi is the first editor of the book. She is a lecturer, or is equivalent of associate professor of anthropology at SOAS in London. We have Quetzil Castaneda, who is very dynamic, former founding convener of the Anthropology of Tourism interest group, and a senior lecturer at Indiana University, and Kathleen Adams, professor of anthropology at Loyola University, Chicago. And so Naomi, this is very much your baby in many ways, although everybody just did such a fantastic job on it. I wanted to just ask you, I guess, to briefly talk about what this book is about. In particular, you have these two kinds of things going on here. You have ed, and you also have ethnography and ethnography of tourism. So what is this book about? How is it arranged? And most importantly, who is it for?
Oh, okay.
Lots of questions.
Before I do that, I want to introduce your assistant moderator, Alex Salazar, who is a doctoral candidate at SOAS in the Department of Anthropology, working with me. So
thank you.
You can give a wave, Alex. Alex may disappear at some point and just be a hidden face, but she's still there seeing your Q&A and your raised hands as the event goes on, even if she vanishes. Okay, to answer the question, what is this book about? This book really, at its base, is a book of intellectual historiography. That is, it is an attempt to track the development of the anthropology of tourism, and more specifically, the ethnographic study of tourism by anthropologists over the last, let's say, 50 years. But more than that even, it's positioning the history of ethnographic study of tourism within the history of anthropology and looking at how different theoretical trends and methodological changes affected, first of all, laid the conditions of possibility for talking about tourism in the first place for anthropologists, and then how those changes led to a focus on tourism, and then the kind of hinge moment that we see Ed Brunner as having played in the history, both of the study of anthropology of tourism, but also more broadly, anthropology. So looking at tourism ethnography and anthropological ethnography in the broad sweep of things, the focus of this book in terms of the scholar that we're emphasizing spans a 70-year career. And so tracking his career tracks an enormous range of approaches in the discipline of anthropology, and we can really see how the history of anthropology nests within that and his role in all of that.
So let me kind of transition here. We also have a number of our students as well, and people from interdisciplinary tourism studies. So let me actually direct Kathleen as our most senior illustrious editor here. What's ethnography? Maybe just, it's a very basic question, but I mean, you know, we should do this, the ground terms here, the main terms.
Okay. Ethnography, for those non-anthropologists with us or budding anthropologists, it's basically the hallmark qualitative ethnic method of cultural anthropology. It's aimed at understanding cultural insiders' perspectives, and it doesn't entail theory testing per se, but rather it's based on what we call grounded theory. And that just means that you go to your quote unquote field site. This is in the classic sense of ethnography.
Not in the COVID era right now that we're in.
Pardon? Yes, and you are immersed in that site. You learn the language, you spend at least a year there. You are the research instrument, and you are participating in people's daily lives. You are following them to work or to wherever else. If you're following tourists, you're going on tours with them. And ultimately, you are taking intensive notes. And the idea is that by living in the community with community members, following them, you will gradually come to better appreciate their perceptions of the world, their understandings of what it is they do and the meaning they make of their lives. And ultimately, the older view of ethnography was that you went off somewhere, you know, and you rooted yourself in that distant community or more local community, and that you were in the field or you were out of the field. And that has really shifted in recent years. And do you want me to say something about that shift maybe?
Sure, why not?
Okay. And very briefly, I'll give you an example. I was schooled in the late 70s, early 80s, before I went to do my research in Indonesia, in a community similar to Ed's community in the highlands in a different island. And when I planned my research, I wanted to study tourism, ethnic and cultural change. And my vision was I would go to Taraja, live with a local family who carved for tourists, and really come to gain an understanding of their interactions with tourists and talk to tourists as they came through. But while I was there, and this was in 84, 85, the first time, I started feeling tremendous guilt. I would leave the field to go renew permits and things, to show my mother Bali and Java when she came to visit. And I came to realize that my guilt was perhaps misplaced, and that there was all of these kind of Taraja outcroppings. There were Taraja carvers studying on Java. There were Taraja tourists on Bali. And I started realizing that the field was not located in one specific place, but rather I should be tracing the outcroppings of Taraja identities and experiences and touristic representations of who they thought Tarajans were. And
so that's a really good example, not to cut you off, but I did, you know, your whole idea of grounded theory, I was just talking about this with my students today. I mean, it's a very bottom up, you know, or emic approach, right? That you came in, you did have an idea, you did have understanding, you spoke the language, you read the theory, but when you were there, you were able to be flexible enough to understand like what was really important by listening to the locals, right? So sorry to cut you off.
And I can wrap it up very quickly. This was a moment, I didn't realize it at the time when I was doing my research, but anthropology was in the process of changing dramatically. And we were shifting from this idea of the field being in a specific locale somewhere out there to it being pretty much a multi-sided kind of thing where you didn't particularly go to one particular in the field spot and then suddenly leave it. And so all of these kinds of ideas were challenged as we came to think of fieldwork as a translocal kind of endeavor, where we would not be going to discrete, defined spaces, but we would be following cultural flows and looking at zones of encounters. And this is very much the norm today in research. And I think Brunner's work really pioneered some of this as well, simultaneously following tourists. So I'll go back.
Right. No, that's great. I know that you wrote in one of your 2 chapters that you have that you know, you really came of age. That whole coming of age story was happening at the same time that Ed Brunner was really working on these big theories that we'll talk about in a minute. So maybe to contextualize it, and then I promise I'll go back to you, Naomi, to talk about really the book, because I do want to talk about the structure of the book. I think it's fantastic. But Quetzil, you've been, you know, you and I have worked together a lot, especially with the Anthropology of Tourism interest group and everything. And you have a great idea of how Brunner kind of fits in, right, at that time period, both in the trajectory of anthropology, but also in the anthropology of tourism. So maybe you could just kind of fill in the gaps here a little bit for us first. And unmute yourself would be great. There we go. There you go.
I said, I bet people would, if you've read my lips, I said, maybe people would appreciate me not unmuting while I spoke.
Right.
The question, Ed Brunner in the context of the late 80s and early 90s. Well, you know, he was a fundamental for many anthropologists of tourism, right? Because he shifted the kinds of ways of thinking about what's relevant, what's important, and shifted to the method, as noted by everyone already, right? And so I think there was, in the end of the 80s, a lot of different kinds of ideas coming up. And so, you know, one of our script questions was about postmodernism. I myself was labeled a postmodernist one day, I think on the back jacket of my book. And I think that Brunner was as well, or is sometimes. And I just think that that's not a very deep understanding of postmodernist theories and things. I think Ed Brunner was sort of a great thinker and researcher in terms of a specific kind of theoretical tradition. And so that really was being developed in the 80s and really became very important for anthropologists of tourism, which was otherwise missing. And so that really was a great reorientation for many of us. But there were also other threads, other people doing, like Kathleen was doing work in the same time I was starting to do work. And we were also thinking about using other kinds of theoretical and conceptual traditions to rethink about how to do field work of tourism, right?
Like
but
what,
Ed,
for example?
Certainly really shifted that attention to in a very specific kind of way to tourists' experience and the relationship of those folks in their situated place to other kinds of contexts, to other locations. And there's lots of ways of doing that. And Ed's was really important in terms of pioneering a shift in anthropology. Right?
Yeah.
And so I think later on, cultural studies people of tourism start talking about this postmodern shift and talking about Ed Brunner and this. And I think we should be very cautious about attributing that kind of idea.
Although, as we we write about in the introduction, Ed was one of the leading anthropologists in the mid to late 70s in launching the postmodern movement in anthropology, and we have passages where we quote from him talking about how he and his colleagues were trying to take postmodern theories, the critical theory they were reading, Derrida, people like that, and applying it, seeing what could we do. Here we are studying the life ways of people around the world. That's what anthropologists supposedly do. How can we take this kind of intellectual ferment that's happening throughout the humanities and start to apply it in our work and to understand people's behavior, their interactions, and the meanings that they derive from those interactions in a different way? So going back, one of the things that I'm really happy about with this book, and this is to go back to this issue of the 70-year career and also the long trajectory of studies of the anthropology of tourism, is that in the introduction and in the first two substantive chapters, those that Nelson Graeber and I wrote and that Kathleen wrote, we write about how Ed Brunner is a really fascinating example of someone who started laying the groundwork, completely unintentionally, I'm sure, but started laying the groundwork for the changes that happened in the 70s. We already see the seeds of it in his work in the 1950s. He's already taking on a kind of very humanistic, looking at individual agency and issues of identity and performance, these kinds of things that very few people were looking at in that way at that time. So he was a constructivist going back to even before he was aware of the term constructivism.
Right. And what does constructivism mean, by the way? Maybe just
constructivism fundamentally means that reality is produced, or social reality is produced in the moment that it is enacted and experienced. So there is no fundamental truth outside of our experiences of the world. There is, of course, a physical reality, and he took pains to stress the difference between reality as it is lived, as it is experienced, and as it is expressed. Yes. And he saw those three different levels as being very important. So really, it's that much larger focus in his work that brought him to tourism. So one of the things that we try to do in this book is to show how he is a hinge point, because he was doing all this work long before he came to tourism. And then he was one of the most prominent people working on tourism at a particular time where he could draw other tourism scholars' attention to this way of doing research. And at that same time, people like Kathleen were running into tourism and their field sites coming out of a similar theoretical, humanistic kind of perspective, but not because Ed worked on tourism, because he was a very prominent thinker in a much larger theoretical sense in the discipline.
Right, Kathleen, I think you mentioned that you knew about Ed's work, the constructivism and everything, way before it was the tourist stuff, right? Yeah. So what did you know about? What was it that caught you?
Well, there were a couple of things that were really of interest to me. I knew I wanted to research Indonesia, and at the time I was interested in art and ethnic relations. Tourism was only being born as a field of study, right? This was the early 80s. And I read Ed's work on Batak migrants. It was very famous within Indonesia. He was looking at Highland Sumatran people who were migrating to the capital, to Jakarta. And I was fascinated by how he described the ways in which, from afar, they formulated their sensibilities about identities. And, so already he was kind of looking at people who were constructing sensibilities about identity, who were in border zones, right? This is another important concept of his. And this concept so I knew his ethnicity work, and we were both kind of discovering tourism around the same time. At University of Washington, there was a seminar on tourism and ethnicity in 1982, and people like Nelson Graeber, who also contributed with Naomi to the book, and Dean McConnell and others, Robert Wood, came to University of Washington, and suddenly I thought, I want to weave this in. And and Ed, meanwhile, on his own, was elsewhere doing his research on tourism. Starting to go on that, but the work for which he was famous in Indonesia in the 80s was really his ethnicity work.
Yeah.
Shall I go back to the question of who the book is for?
Yes.
Since we've gotten kind of into the weeds here in the deep history of anthropology and the
Sure.
anthropology of tourism. And this book is really designed for multiple different audiences. One, and I hope that this was clear in part with Kathleen explaining what ethnography is. Part of the idea of this book is that it's for tourism studies scholars who are not necessarily really familiar with anthropology and what anthropology has done, both in the field of tourism studies, but also more broadly. It's for undergraduates who are coming to think about tourism for the first time, perhaps upper division undergraduates taking a class in the Anthropology of Tourism. It's for doctoral students or graduate students in general interested in any aspect of interpretive or humanistic anthropology, questions of representation, narrative, and the ways that experience gets shaped by broadly circulating imaginaries or systems of representation. And the way that we structured the book, I don't know, do you want me to say something about this, Michael?
I was just gonna, yeah, I was actually gonna say you should talk about that. I really like the way that you structured the book. I think it's an excellent. This is an edited volume for those of you who didn't realize these are not just the authors; they're editors, and there are 13 contributors altogether, including me. I contributed something as well, and that's a lot of work to do. It's a lot to try to shepherd people to make something cohesive, right? Something that I'm really passionate about myself. That's why I'm the editor of a book series. I want everything to be very cohesive. And I think, Naomi, really, you guys did, also the book should be for other people who are editing volumes, because I think it's a very cohesive book. The structure is very well laid out. You have keywords, you have all these kinds of things that really ensure that even though people are writing from their own perspectives, and I want you to talk about this in particular, it just seems like it is a book that you can pick up and read. It isn't that it's like a collection of random things. It's a very, very good cohesive book. It's a good lesson on what to do when you're editing a volume, actually.
Perhaps. There's also, I think that to be fair to all edited volume editors everywhere, I will say that this book went through many iterations. And the book's genesis was an idea that Quetzil had that was very much about thinking about Ed Brunner within the historical suite of work in the Anthropology of Tourism. And I hope that Quetzil will get to talk about that in a few minutes. But the idea of the book was a little bit different from the panel that it arose out of. So we took it a little bit further than the looking specifically at Ed Brunner's ideas and how he fits into the discipline, and wanted also to think about what's happening now with the ideas that he is famous for. So the book is laid out, and this is, I think, Quetzil, I think this might have been your doing, and I love it. The sections of our book, that it starts with part one is orientation. So we're traveling through this material. Part one is orientation, and that is the theoretical and historical introduction to the book. And then points of departure, which is 2 chapters that take you through Ed Brunner's earlier work, his education, and through his earlier work. Thank you, Quetzil. That shows how certain concepts were continually throughout his work as over the course of this 70-year career. And then into specifically his role in the postmodern or interpretive turn in anthropology more broadly, where we have Julia Harrison's article on the importance of stories and emotion in his work, and then also in her work and in the work of others at the time and later. The next section, explorations, concepts, and debates, was intended to take as keywords some of the concepts that Ed Brunner is particularly associated with. He's not the only one who's written about these concepts, but his terminology has become very widespread. Right. So, for example, the first chapter has the keyword you see at the top of the page there, authenticity. And we invited Walt Little, who is here with us today, to write about how the concept of authenticity appears in Ed's work, how others have dealt with it, and then what he has done with it in his own work, extending the concept. And we do that with a whole series. I'm not going to go over the whole book right now, but oh, maybe I am. With the idea of the border zone, where Valeria Simoni writes about encounters in his work that take place in the border zone. That's the key word to think about this concept. We do the same with constructivism, with Sally Ness's article about the production of meaning and reality in the moment of encounter. And then the final section that is these kinds of contributory ethnographic essays is called Further Afield, New Departures. And that's where our contributors, Kathleen, David Picard, and Quetzil, are each taking some of Ed's concepts, merging them together in new and different ways, and developing them in their own work and showing how they underpin new kinds of directions that they've gone to, or how their work differentiates or diverges in important ways that also shed light back on Brunner's contributions. The final section is it becomes kind of a life history. We wanted to do a theoretical and biographical interview with Ed to understand how it was that he developed the concepts that he did and what his intellectual milieu was like. Who was he working with? How did he come up with these ideas? And who does he credit as influences? And Quetzil, Michael, and I did an initial interview. Michael did the bulk of the interview and then edited it together with Ed, and there's commentary. It's a really fascinating piece of intellectual history. Then we have Ed's reflections. And then lastly and afterward, about taking the ethnography of tourism outside anthropology, outside Ed's work, and looking at how it is now permeated. Oh, thanks, Quetzil. How it is, ethnography has permeated the disciplines and is used by a wide range of tourism scholars. So the book, the structure of the book, the idea was that it would take us through this arch, the sort of arching structure of what is anthropology, what is the ethnography of tourism, how is Ed kind of a hinge figure, a focal point for us to think through changes in the subfield, then into this series of keywords or core concepts in the anthropology and ethnography of tourism, into his particular intellectual history again, and then out into the future. So we're trying to really get a grasp on 50 years of history of a subfield, 70 years in the history of anthropology, and where we go next. And Quetzil wants to say something.
Yeah. Quetzil, do you want to say something?
You're muted.
I was told that I could use the space bar to unmute myself, but apparently it didn't work.
All right.
I was asking Mike to see if he could get a page, the TOC up, because what I apparently put up was an earlier version. That's not the accurate table of contents.
I'll have to look for it. So, but you know what you can do? Everybody can go to the website and you can take a look at it, and then of course you can purchase the book if you want as well. But you know, but at any rate, yeah, stop sharing your screen.
That's not us.
Yes.
But at any rate, let me bring this back, okay, a little bit. So why Ed, right? So you have this book, okay? You're doing two different things at the same time. On the one hand, you're talking about this ethnographic methods, which is something that is our bread and butter as anthropologists, and how it relates to tourism. And I should underscore actually that this is so important, because a lot of tourism research has been not relegated, but it's been kind of migrated into more business, quantitative research aspects, and it seems so like new and interesting to do, and you know, whatever, to do ethnography, but we have been doing ethnography for quite a while on tourism, you know, so it's nice that, you know, to bring this to a larger audience. That's number one. But then Ed, as I've heard you guys all say, Ed came to tourism later in his career, something that is worth talking about. I mean, I think one of his most wonderful talks he ever did, one of the most wonderful things he ever wrote, was, I think it's called The Aging Anthropologist. Is that what it was? It's just this wonderful thing about life stages and how he's changed his fields and his concentrations as his age changes, you know, and as his life, periods of his life change. I was crying when I heard it when he delivered it at the AAA's years ago. You know, so he came to this late. He wasn't in that first wave, as Quetzil, you know, has talked about before, of anthropologists like Valine Smith and Nelson Graeber, and even Dean McCann, who's a sociologist. But, you know, but yet he is so important. So why Ed as opposed to somebody else? I don't know. Any of you want to take it? And Naomi, of course, you could take it, but
I'll toss it to Quetzil.
Actually, Quetzil, why? Because you started with a panel. It was a panel at the AAA's. Why Ed? I believe we were doing a festschrift, we were doing the celebration for the 40th anniversary of the Anthropology of Tourism with Valine Smith and Nelson Graeber, Shinji, who's here in the audience, and those people. But but we also slipped in Ed as a separate panel, I believe, when you were the convener of ATAP.
Yeah, it was,
I wanted to insist that it not simply be about an original generation of anthropologists, of tourism scholars. And it seemed clear that Ed Brunner was, because of his work that was coming out, well, when I became aware of it, the Abraham Lincoln and the Salem Museum, what else?
Right, that's all about authenticity.
The 90, 91, 92 articles that came out really were very important, because it really, here's an established scholar who is doing other kinds of work, turns to tourism, and despite the fact that the earlier generation, the Valen Smith and so on, and Nelson Graeber are not nobodies, right? They're not real scholars, but they suffered from a kind of stigma, which was that they're not doing real work because they're studying tourism. And so, I mean, all of these folks talked about this in all of their commentaries, reflections on the history of the field. And one thing that Ed Brunner did, if anything, was shift the kind of the degree of seriousness that tourism was accepted or viewed by which it was viewed in academic anthropological academia.
Do you think that he was successful with that because he didn't come from the anthropology of tourism field, but that he was coming like lateral?
Oh, clearly.
Like different, yeah.
Clearly.
Yeah.
I mean, the first generation of people, they said, hey, I'm doing anthropology and tourism is really important. I'll study it. Very good, very smart, very, that was very, very hugely important. I mean, I guess, what's his Nunez that was studying the tourism in Mexico, that was a secondary project, right? A sort of, oh, by the way, But for the most part, many of these other folks started with tourism,
Nelson didn't.
And that was delegitimated. It was not considered legitimate. And so Ed Brunner's work, because he was an established scholar with a long career, he was very important in making this shift, and also inspiring for a whole new other generation of anthropologists that that were doing work and figuring out, oh, there's this old other style, this original scholarship of anthropology of tourism that is not using the kinds of things that is now being current at the end of the 80s or 80s. And, because we all have to kill the father or kill the mother as academics, that's
sure.
Those earlier folks were slaughtered.
It definitely was inspiring. Yeah. But do you want to say something, Naomi? I think you.
I have a different history. Quetzil and I, we go round and round and round about this.
We don't agree.
We've been disagreeing on this for 7 years now, so we have different perspectives on this. I think that Quetzil puts his finger on something really important about Ed Brunner's role in the history of anthropological studies of tourism, and I would love to hear Kathleen's perspective on this, since she was finishing her PhD and then going on to be a junior faculty member at this very moment in time that we're talking about. But what Ed did is he had already become very prominent in a particular approach to anthropology. That is, he was an interpretive humanist anthropologist, and he was very involved, for example, with Victor and Edie Turner in the Anthropology of Experience, with Barbara Babcock and Barbara Meyerhoff in thinking about representation, the arts. And so his whole approach developed before he applied it to tourism. And by the time he started looking at tourism, he'd already retired. He was an emeritus professor.
On the verge of retiring.
Very prominent. He'd already been the president of the Society for Humanistic Anthropology, and I think also AES, and had been on the board of the AAA. So he was very, very well known, very prominent, very successful in sharing his critical approach. So he could then shift to tourism. He had street cred. That is not to say, and this is where Quetzil and I diverge, this is not to say that those people who were writing in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s did not continue to change alongside people like Ed Brunner. In fact, Ed is older than Nelson Graeber by a decade, for example. And Nelson's work has evolved just as much, but Nelson was already very much working, and I imagine Nelson's going to want to weigh in on this very soon because I know he's here. But Nelson was immersed in tourism from the mid to late 1960s into the 70s because it appeared in his field site and it was so clearly an important issue.
Ethnic and Tourist Arts, the book I carried with me to the field. Yes.
So one of the things that I think is really fascinating in our book is Nelson's contribution, which we co-authored it, but it's really his vision of how he and Ed, they were educated 10 years apart, but they went through very similar shifts in the discipline during that time, and they both ended up becoming constructivists who studied tourism. They just did it at different moments in time.
Exactly. I want to key in on a couple of these keywords because we are, losing time here. But one of the things I think, you mentioned the anthropology of experience. Okay. Ed is very, that book with the edited volume with Victor Turner is just a seminal piece of work. It came before he did any tourism stuff. How does focusing on experience, which is of course what tourists collect in general, right? I mean, tourism is all about experiences. How has focusing on experience changed how we study in ethnography in general, but how we do ethnography of tourism? I don't know if somebody wants to take that, Kathleen or anybody. Does anybody want to?
I can, or if Kathleen wants to, or
Go ahead, Naomi, you do it.
All right, Naomi, why don't you talk about it?
Okay, so there's also, we've got a question in the Q&A, has any serious work been done on structure of emotion and tourist experience? And that's really very much what Ed's contribution was. This takes us a little bit into a slightly more theoretical territory, but I think it's worth explaining. And this also answers another question that we had at one point in the chat, and we do ask, please, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A field. Because our moderator, Alex, is not looking in the chat field, she's looking in the Q&A field. I happen to say it pop out. Someone wanted to know what the border zone was, so let me take a step back here. Okay, I'll seed it for you, and then because what I was gonna say is that Ed's work, first of all, his interest in experience was to see culture as alive, something that is produced moment by moment as people live it and experience it. So we can't study something like a dramatic performance or a ritual or any kind of major life event or any moment by moment interaction. We can't understand that without understanding it as someone's experience. So each individual performance, each individual encounter has its own meaning that's determined by the context around it. So when he brought that to tourism, what he's looking at is what happens with this particular confluence of people and prior imaginings and material surroundings and performers that generates the meanings that those people give to it. And he finds that different tourists, even within one tour group, may attribute very different meanings to what they're seeing. So he really brought that concern with meaning and also the fluidity of human experience to the study of tourism. Part of where this comes out of is Ed was very heavily influenced by symbolic interactionism, and he did some reading in symbolic interactionism as a doctoral student. And symbolic interactionism is a theoretical subfield of sociology that looks at how meaning is produced in encounters between people. And in fact, the term encounter, which Ed uses throughout his work, and many of us use without realizing that we've picked up this terminology from symbolic interactionism, encounter refers to what they call the smallest meaningful unit of society. So the encounter is where meanings are produced in between people by the assumptions that they bring to the encounter, the framing that they put the encounter within. So Ed takes that to tourist encounters in particular, between tourists and local people, between the performers and the anthropologist who's come in to study them along with a tour group, and he looks at how meaning is produced in those, which is classic symbolic interactionism.
But one of the problems that I have with symbolic interactionism, though, is this idea, though, that Goffman and others say that we're always constantly calculating and thinking about what the other person is going to do, what my action or what I say is going to affect, how it's going to be affected. And, we're kind of almost like robots trying to think this stuff out. I mean, that's the way that I've always kind of learned about it. You don't see it that way, though. It's not how Ed is talking about it, though. But
no, it's not how Ed's talking about it at all. But it's also not how I read, Garfinkel and Bloomer and people like that. These theorists who are really, they're more interested in the kind of indeterminacy and where the slippage happens. And I don't think that someone, and I'm sorry, this is getting very theoretical for people who just came to hear about the ethnography of tourism, but it actually is underpinning the kind of work that we're talking about here that Ed was doing, which is that if you're interested in meaning and how meaning is generated, then you need to recognize, for example, that people are not thinking consciously about the thinking ahead they're doing. So when we talk about tourist expectations, and maybe Jonathan Skinner will pipe up at some point about this.
And Jackie
again,
just gave a good comment too about that.
Okay. Yeah, so I can't focus on the chat and the Q&A at the same time. That's finish what I was gonna say. And now I've lost what I was gonna say because I got distracted. But I will pass it now to Kathleen, because I think that this idea of encounter is part of where the border zone concept comes from. So Kathleen, you were going to address that.
And border zones, just briefly, someone asked this in, I think, the chat section. They're performative spaces, right? Where tourists and, you know, broadly speaking, locals, all in all their diversity, encounter one another. And so one of the things that I think I'm really appreciative of Ed's concept of touristic border zone is that he really emphasizes the creativity that happens in those spaces. And I think he's really the first to kind of seed the idea that these are imaginative spaces, right? Where basically they're performative, they're imaginative, and there's a whole operative cultural imaginary that happens in these spaces where people are encountering one another. And these spaces can be formal performances, right? Like a monkey dance in a staged temple space in Bali, but they can also be more informal encounters, as he describes in one of his articles, where he takes a group of tourists to encounter a member of the royal family of Yogyakarta in Java. And basically in these spaces, people are engaging in what he terms improvisational theater. And this is a theme, this idea of these border zones, these touristic border zones, overlaps a little with Mary Louise Pratt's work on contact zones. One of the things I see is a little bit different, though, that Mary Louise Pratt talks about kind of also material culture, right? That can be a kind of contact zone. My sense, and maybe some of you will disagree with me, is that Ed is much more interested in the live kinds of face-to-face encounters in these touristic border zones, and the creativity that happens in these spaces.
Although we definitely have, you know, Walter Little, for example, writes about the materiality, right, in this book, you know, about that, which is nice.
No, a lot of people have taken it other places.
And I think for those of you who are uninitiated, one second, Naomi, you know, I think that what's really important, though, too, about what's humanistic or how it's opening up to ethnography here is the fact that, you know, previously we have more kind of, let's say, structuralist or more formal kinds of ideas of hosts and guests circulating around in the 1970s. And here he's kind of, you know, you're still acknowledging that those are stakeholders, but you're saying that these aren't two monolithic categories. They're not just trying to do things to each other, but that there's a bigger context, and that these zones of interaction, these points of contact, really are going to create something new. And just to say my own little bit about where I've come to appreciate Ed is that I, like Ed, you know, I came to tourism after working in the tourism industry for a couple of years as an educational tour operator. And the first books I read were really, one of them was on Ed, and the other, of course, was, you know, the Anthropology of Tourism, Bellion Smith's book. And I was, and also Dean McCannell's, and in my ignorance as a younger, uninitiated anthropology student, you know, I got very kind of frustrated with stuff like Dennis and Nash saying that tourism is a form of imperialism, and you know, and what I read, and I know I'm wrong, I don't know if Dean is here, whom I love, but Dean McCannell's idea, which is very, you know, Goffmanian approach, that is a staged authenticity, like we're some, you know, nefarious group of tour operators with cigars, you know, trying to dupe people, you know, was how I read it. Not that that's what he was saying. But then you look at Ed's stuff, and it's so much more humanistic. It's so much, in my opinion, at the time, it was so much more nuanced. I think probably part of it came because Ed himself came to tourism being a study leader for educational tours, and he was taking people around, and he was negotiating, you know, what is the facts? What am I supposed to say? And what is authentic and what isn't, and do I give all those tourists information? He saw that some tourists were very upset when he would say, oh, well, this thing isn't really historically accurate, but they're doing it for you, but that's okay, versus, you know, they just want to be like, no, I just want to know, you know? So I think that there's something there about the contact zone that coming from that situation that really drew me to him, but really shows the humanity, the humanistic side that ethnography really had at the time. I don't know if you agree.
Can I just jump in and say one word about that? And I totally agree. What also impressed me about his work was his attentiveness to the emotional dimensions of these encounters.
Yeah, and Sagar Singh asked about this as well. Yeah. Please
go ahead. I mean,
No, I wanted you to say about the emotional thing. We did have a question about it. That's why.
And then Quetzil's finger raised.
Go ahead.
No, Kathleen, go ahead.
To follow up on Kathleen's point about the Mary Pratt's, the difference with Mary Pratt's concept of contact zone, I think it's really important to think about that question is interesting because it really does point in the the specificity of Brunner's contribution is a humanistic constructivism located through ethnography, right?
Not power.
But there are other modes and approaches to studying tourism that were emerging also at this time. And this is one of the points of difference between Naomi and I is, I would insist on not we have different understandings of the history. And one of the points that I would, for myself, I think is important to differentiate is not to collapse humanism as a kind of postmodernism per se, or humanism as postmodernism, or constructivism as postmodernism. There are varieties of each of these things that do different kinds of things. And so the interesting thing about contact zone is it's doing something that is similar to what Pratt's contact zone versus Brunner's contact zone are doing something different in different kinds of attentions. And so one of the beauties of Brunner's idea of contact zone is it is about tracing things that are happening here in other locations. And that's what Pratt gave priority to in the beginning. And maybe later on, other people who pick it up do other kinds of things with that. And Brunner initially was sort of pointing, this is about, how do things connect in a space, but his priority at the moment when he's developing the concept is more that emotional, humanistic, experiential kind of thing. And so this goes to the points where, on the one hand, I think it's important that we differentiate the sort of the legacies and trajectories of concepts, but also understand that things get, once they're out and circulating, they get mixed and mashed in different kinds of ways that are uncontrollable and maybe not really worth.
Yeah,
I have one comment. The question you said about, Mike, about critique of Goffman and the symbolic interactionism, I heard a very interesting, nice phrase. It was about a TV show, and the actor described his role in the TV and the plot is the egg in the cake. And I think that is a very nice metaphor. The egg in the cake. There's no impact. The egg, go and taste the egg in your next time you have a piece of cake. Try to taste it. But it's there. It's always pervasive. And it's not cake without the egg in there, right?
It's the glue.
And so there's
the glue.
And I think that's an interesting idea to think about all the kinds of complications that are going on with tourism in different kinds of ways, and thinking about approaches and the value of Brunner's work, the value of ethnography.
Sure. Great. Kathleen, and then I have two more questions, and then we have to go to Q&A.
Oh, it's probably not as relevant. I wanted to say that one of the contributions that I really value from Ed, of course, is this humanistic, emotional influence. And I just wanted to very quickly say, I think Pratt perhaps highlighted more the asymmetries of power in those contact zones. And the more attentiveness to the kind of what one might call, economics and, other issues that I think were just perhaps a little bit less interesting, because Ed was more about exploring the sort of humanistic side of things. So for him, that was where his emphasis went. That's my read, at least.
I would like to say one thing about this, just real quick, about the contact zone and border zone thing. So to answer the question about what is the border zone, in Ed's work, in the very simplest, most basic sense, he says that the border zone is where the performers and the tourists each come out of their everyday lives and come together for this encounter, and then they go back to their everyday lives. So the idea, his vision, this is a temporary space. And Valerio Simoni, in his chapter, does a really interesting kind of twist on this concept, where he says, no, what if people basically live in the border zone, that engaging with tourists is their everyday life? Right. And I think when we look at these kinds of concepts within their larger context, we're able to really play with them, I think, more effectively, the way that Valerio does there.
With Cuban.
In our chapter, Nelson and I take that back to thinking about what is the social space that's being written about, and how have other anthropologists, what kind of intellectual trajectory is Brunner coming out of and actually working in parallel with, to go back to what Quetzil was saying about how lots of people are having these kind of analogous ideas at the same time. They're doing slightly different work with them. So if we take this overarching concept of a social space, and the tourist encounter in the border zone is one kind of very productive interstitial, neither one nor the other kind of encounter where creativity, as Kathleen said, can come into play, and new meanings are generated, new kinds of relationships, new identities. The same thing happens with the contact zone concept, even Homi Bhabha's third space. All of these kinds of concepts are about a form of social space in which creative, unexpected things can happen.
So let me just bring it back to ethnography a little bit. And I do have these two questions and we really need to get going. How do you study that then? How are you studying it ethnographically? Bring it back to ethnography. Who can do that for me? All right, Quetzil, you can do it for me. Unmute yourself. Thank you.
I'm not sure, you know, I think our forefathers and foremothers, the ancestor anthropologists, did a good job in creating a methodology called ethnography that allows us a lot of different ways to do that. I don't think that that there's anything.
You're going to disagree.
There are new spaces, right? There are all sorts of new spaces.
But I mean, it's
to give you an example. You can go on the internet now and do, you know, ethnography. So there's, we're going into new spaces with our older.
Here's the question that I wanted to ask as well. I think one of Ed's really fundamental things was, and there's a quote that I think you use in the book and everything, is that in these liminal, although he would never use that term, you know, he worked with Victor Turner. But in these border zone places, there are places for creativity and negotiation and self-transformation. And several of the chapters in your book, and all of us have experienced it, is that being a tourist, being an ethnographer transforms you in some way. Quetzil, you know, you have in your acknowledgments talking about your mother and you as a kid in Chichen Itza.
Oh my God, I didn't think anybody read that.
The footnotes are the only thing I read. I don't read the actual stuff you write, but just the footnote. But the, you know, how does it can somebody talk about the transformational quality that Ed is discussing here? How do you seek self-transformation?
I'll totally take that.
Okay.
So, you know, Ed has this article that gets cited all over the place, but I'm not quite sure people are reading it carefully when they cite it, called The Transformation of Self in Tourism.
Right.
And what he's writing about there is that we have this sort of Western discourse of how the self is transformed through travel, that travel enables us to become better people. And actually what he writes is that, you know, you can say this, but in fact, what we find is that the local people are transformed much more by tourism than the tourists are, because the tourists show up, they have an expectation of what they're going to find. They find it, they leave. Mm-hmm. And they are often not changed as much. Now, that isn't to say that he doesn't think that tourism can have a transformative effect. But in that particular article, he's saying that we have an ideology around this that actually isn't necessarily played out when we look ethnographically at what's happening in tourism encounters. Right. But then to answer the question directly, I think if you take Ed's processual approach to any cultural phenomena, and that means processual meaning studying it as it is in process, unfolding, and this is what we do as ethnographers. We hang out as things are happening so that we understand how situations evolve over time and what their effects are. If that's already your approach to what it is that we study and how you study it, then we are always becoming ourselves in each given moment. And so we are always transformed by whatever it is we're doing. So if we are hanging out and exploring experience by accompanying people through their experience and hearing them talk about it, then we are necessarily, if we're attentive to it, studying the transformation of the selves of the people that we are moving through time with as ethnographers.
Right. And then, you know, I think that's a great answer. So where do we go from here, I think, is the last question that we should say. I know that Paula Mota Santos had asked, you know, about COVID. That was going to be my last question as well. So, I mean, everything seems to have changed in the last year. Look at us. We're not even meeting face to face. We're in our Zoom panels and things like that. How do we do ethnography? How do we do tourism studies in this day and age?
This is where I was trying to piggyback on what Quetzil was saying, where I think there are a couple of things. Technology, right? That's what we're doing right now. I'm Zoom meeting with my friends in Taraja and hearing about the brand new airport that they hope will bring in all sorts of new tourists, along with government officials, right? So there's a whole different kind of ethnographic work in new spaces that we can do that I think of it as a different kind of border zone. And I wanted to add to that I think that this moment reminds us that we need to do and be more responsible for doing collaborative work with our local mentors and collaborative authorships. There's no way that we can, at a distance, unless we want to go back to kind of World War II, Chrysanthemum and the Sword type studies. We can't do effective research at a distance, and this because it's not grounded. It's not, as Naomi says, people coming together in these spaces physically, and I think that's very important in terms of the essential kind of sentient dimension of fieldwork as well. So how do we do it? We do more and more collaborative work, and we give more full credit to our mentors in the field, and by perhaps co-authorship. But that, I want to leave space for others.
What do you think? I brought Paula in here. Paula, are you here? You can unmute yourself if you'd like.
Reveal yourself.
Are you here?
Paula?
Oh, it's good to see you. I know where you are.
We've been there. Speaking of tourism and travel.
So what was your question? Unmute.
Sorry, no, the question was precisely about, anthropology in general, but really anthropology of tourism and the COVID-19 era that we hope won't be that long-lived. But how does that affect? Kathleen mentioned about these other spaces, but you're describing is a continuation of contacts that you already had.
Yes.
Okay, so which is very different from starting anew. Okay, but the question was that because the book kind of traces a sort of a progression, an historical process within the anthropology of tourism through the work of a fantastic scholar. My question was, where do you see it going? Even if we kind of non-consider the COVID-19 situation. So by looking at everything that is actually reported and referred to in the book as a sort of grand tableau of anthropology of tourism, where would you see it in terms of future, even if you don't want to consider the COVID-19 situation? Well, that was it.
And we have very similar other questions that are pretty similar. How can Brunner's work kind of be extended? How, Mary Mustafina-Jad, I don't know if she's here, but she wrote a nice afterword as well on that.
Yeah.
I don't know, should we bring
Mary is
here? It would be great to have her speak. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
If Mary's here, it would be lovely to have her speak to critical tourism studies, which I think is where things are headed now.
I'll look for her, but why don't you answer while I bring Mary in on this?
Yeah, do bring her in because she's important. She was involved in establishing one of the organizations. Here she is, great. The Asia Pacific branch. Mary.
We can't hear you, Mary. Good morning, Mary. It's very early in Hawaii.
Yes, it is. Good morning.
Good morning.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No, so I wrote a chapter with Peg Swain on sort of the ethnography of tourism sort of outside of anthropology. And this has been something that I'm very close to because I've sort of shifted from anthropology to tourism studies to geography. And so I think that I had a student yesterday ask me, what's the difference between geography and anthropology of tourism? And I think what anthropology has offered tourism studies is really that grounded ethnographic perspective. And I just keep going back to that. And in many ways, it's been applied in other fields in to various degrees, right? And so I think from the anthropology side, there's always this question of sort of, is that real ethnography, right? I feel like anthropologists are very sort of protective of what constitutes ethnography.
We came up with it. I mean, really, you know.
That's right. That's right.
Quetzil, yeah.
Peg is here. You should.
Oh, bring her on. Yes, I didn't think she was here. Sorry, Peg.
But can we, before we leave this question though, because, well, Peg, actually it'd be great to bring Peg on for this as well, but two things together. One, so both Paula's question and we have another question here from, I don't know how to pronounce the last name, but Karsten Wergen, who says, so tourist encounter and experience are very limited by the pandemic. What happens to the ethnography of tourism under these new circumstances? And how might it change methodologically and theoretically? How can Brunner's contribution help us think through this? And I think both, there's sort of two ways we can answer that, as well as Paula's question. And one is moving beyond Brunner. And I think this is something that Mary and Peg can really speak to, and they start to get into it in their afterward. And then I would like to come back to that question and think about how Brunner, if we continue traveling with Brunner, how we might think about field work in a time where there is very little tourism. But let me give it back to Mary and Peg.
Well, this is where the imaginary comes in, which is another thing that's another direction here. But again, given the humanistic focus of Ed, it was not that far a leap to start thinking in terms of traveling in the mind and traveling through the mind. And here we are. And I think, yeah, as one of many, many people who's been locked down since, well, actually January in my case, not being able to physically move is a huge challenge. And I think we're so acutely aware as individuals as well as scholars of tourism that the ground has shifted dramatically. And this is something that I think Ed in his life experience was able to give us some guide points along the way, which is yeah, stuff changes and now what? And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Sure. I know Shinji also had a question. Shinji, are you there? About doing tourism and ethnography in the COVID era. Are you asleep? It's very late in Japan.
It's terribly late.
Can you log in? When they bring you in, unmute your mic, my friends.
Yeah. Shinji.
Or you have to unmute them for them.
I can unmute, but I don't know if are you here?
He might have.
All right. Well, I don't know what the question was because Alex just oh, here's Shinji. Yes.
Yes, it's 1 o'clock in the morning in Tokyo, so I'm a little bit sleepy. But I'm very, interested in your talk, and I sent my Q&A to all of you about the ethnography, online ethnography of tourism, especially at the time of COVID-19 pandemic.
Right.
How is the experience, tourist experience in online? Because in Japan now, the development of online tourism in various fields of tourism. Maybe in the world, it's the same thing happens. It's challenging for us.
Yeah. I mean, it's isolating, it's challenging, and then you have to kind of look at new approaches. And I think, what I'm seeing, and I correct me too, Mary, if I'm wrong here, but what we're seeing, it always changes. Anthropology always changes as with the rest of the world. We adapt theoretically, and then like Kathleen writes in the book, we adapt ethnographically as well. And so hi Shinji, how do we, this is kind of the thing, where do we, things are always going to change. Should we even think that it should stay the same, I think is part of the issue.
Right, yeah.
I think also this is, and Peg mentioned this in saying that, Ed really modeled this for us, that as the world changes around you, your research questions change and you change. And the kinds, he writes really eloquently about how his own changing physical condition, as you mentioned, Michael, earlier on, in The Aging Anthropologist, his own physical condition changes the kinds of field work he can do, what he has the energy to do. And I think that really, as anthropologists, if we follow in that kind of experiential mode and say, okay, well, the world is changing, people's experiences are changing, therefore our discipline needs to change. We are all, by virtue of being human in this moment in time, participating in the effects of COVID-19 on things like our ability to travel. We are right now, unintentionally, I guess, doing field work on what it is to communicate online and find community online and travel virtually online, because here we are all occupying bizarrely the same space time, even though it's the middle of night for Shinji Yamashita and it's very early morning for Mary.
Yeah.
And yet here we all are together. So I think for us to shift into doing online fieldwork, it merely means coming to experience this other way of being, just like anthropologists who started out going to very foreign lands had to adjust to other ways of being.
Can I piggyback on what you just said? Because I think, you know, there's a kind of cyber travel dimension to this. For instance, to fuel funds towards Balinese entrepreneurs who no longer have tourists. I'm finding myself saying, I'm going to take a cooking class and do it online. And these are folks who used to host tourists, and now they're hosting small groups of friends, you know, to teach in their Balinese home how to cook. And I mean, you can do a different kind of ethnography in that way online. And you can look at issues of economic challenges, health challenges, the ways in which people are navigating. You can also deal somewhat with emotion in those spaces. So I don't think you necessarily have to have a long-term established relationships from face-to-face field work to be able to move into those spaces. And many of the people I'm talking with now, even in Toronto, are people I never knew except through Facebook and other spaces. And so I think we just need to think more creatively about how to take, you know, our basic ethnographic skills that Quetzil referred to earlier and expand them into new zones during COVID.
Sure. Now, I wanted to bring Jackie Feldman in, coming in from, you're finally out of France after being quarantined in France for months, back in Israel. I think you have a great question about the issues with humanism and how far it goes in, let's say, the interdisciplinary tourism realm.
Well, I always, you know, one of the things I found on reading Ed was, as I came from many years working as a tour guide, then into anthropology, you know, in reading his deliberations on, you know, being a tour guide in Indonesia is you know, very sympathetic and kindred spirit in terms of trying to, even if the proportions were different.
Frank, if you could get me a
to juggle guiding and analyzing it, and this sort of reflexivity. And in some ways, what's for Ed, it was easy because say, okay, I don't want to lie, I lose the job and go back. But that's, you know, I lose this position so that the tour company won't ask me again. Right. But I wonder
that happened to Ed. They said,
right,
no, we don't want you to
yes,
come
exactly.
You're not saying the right thing.
Right, yeah. Right. But you wonder, you know, how much of this, and I don't know if some have found it with students, of a kind of initiation to get over their disappointment of initially coming to, you know, to explore this kind of tourist fantasy, and then, you know, one ripping away and seeing what's behind the scenes, the sort of demystification, right? The Maasais are checking their cell phones and getting out of their jeans when they get the call before the tourists show up. Right. And it's something that's accompanied me in the few times when I've gone back to guide groups and say, can I really say this anymore after reading Ed? Am I comfortable with this sort of mystification? And people very often, as Ed found as well, and they don't want to know always what's behind the scenes. There's a mystification sometimes that's essential for a large proportion of tourism, at least on the part of the tourists, that Ed again points out.
And, you know, we do see a couple of questions here, just to piggyback, you know, about staged authenticity or authenticity. Maybe one of you guys, while I bring in Jonathan Skinner, I think, can you talk a little bit about Ed's idea of what is authentic, right? What becomes authentic when we take tourists to these staged sites? Is it staged, not authentic?
Can we bring Walt in for that, since he
and
wrote the
Walt,
chapter?
and I'll bring Walter too. But why don't you start talking, because it's going to take a minute. Walter.
Kathleen? Will you take this one?
Did you say coup?
I said Kathleen, but you can do it, Quetzil, while we're waiting for, oh, there's Walt.
About
Never mind.
authenticity. Authenticity is always a problem. It's not going to go away. I mean, it's always constructed. This question about whether it's going to be less constructed. No, we're constructing authenticity right now in this, with this video, right? I think I just want to link up this perhaps question with about authenticity. It doesn't go away. It just takes different forms of how you create realities and the reality or mystification, right? And so it's always been the case. I don't think there's anything new in the fact that in some situations you want to know, you want to demystify. In other places, in other kinds of arenas or life, there's people seek to want to demystify what's going on. Oh my God, the magician show, and others don't want to ever see the magician show demystified, right? So that's been a constant for everybody throughout. I don't think there's anything new about that in today's world.
So let's go to Walt.
I think which brings me to a question. Mary said something about, oh my gosh, anthropologists want to make are wanting to not let don't like it when other people try to do ethnography or claim it. One thing that happens when we're doing COVID, when in this new life of using technologies, everybody's using technologies, right? So when we do ethnography, the question is, what is ethnography? Is it a method, or is it an approach? Is it a set of questions or analyses, concepts that you're applying? So I think it's very important to think about that in this context. What the question that is raised here is, what really is uniquely ethnography about doing work, living this new reality, right? And what would make, is ethnography simply, recording this Zoom meeting and then saying, hey, so-and-so said first, and then somebody responded? The challenge here is thinking what constitutes an ethnographic analysis and its value and its significance. For me, it's less important how to do ethnography. We can always do ethnography, but the question that is raised in this situation, this new life world that we're living, is what makes ethnography specifically significant, different than the ethnographies that everybody else is already doing in their everyday life all the time, right? Because we're doing ethnography always. So what makes it uniquely ethnographic in an anthropological sense is the crucial question. And that goes back to this idea of demystification or staged authenticity. There's always authenticities being constructed. There's always mystification. There's always people who want to demystify, always people who want to make more mystification. So what do we do as ethnographers? How do we interpret all of that and analyze that? That's the more interesting kind of question. Yeah, for me.
So unfortunately, we're really out of time. I know I pulled Walt in, and I actually want to start with you. So you hang on, Jonathan. I know you had a question from the very beginning. So can we just end with Jonathan, and then I want to start the next section actually, if you're all right with it, Walt, because I know you have to go with you. Jonathan, one last question.
No, thank you to everyone, and I think a very fitting tribute and volume to a restless man, but in a very sort of constructive way. I really liked the volume. I read some drafts of it and really appreciated that, and I saw it as being akin to sort of Works and Lives that Clifford Geertz was sort of trying to do, like a biographical as well as intellectual trajectory in it, and it really sort of captured that. I thought that there's a lot of sort of telling and retelling in Brunner's work, and he stresses the narrative and in text, play, and story. He looks at the relationship between the self and society, and I wondered in our sort of tellings and retellings of Brunner, where he's going next, because I think his work is still very alive in us. So I hear the conversations about how we're looking at the anthropology of tourism in COVID, but also where would Ed be going? Where is he going next? What would he be sort of looking at?
Yeah, what do you think? I know he had a lot of I know he had a lot of questions. Can you hear me? I know he had a lot of questions when I was doing the interview about things he wished he would have looked at, right? And I don't think a lot of that actually got in. He definitely brought up things like race and gender. He brought up, he really wanted to follow the tourists home. And that was a limit that other people have done, but that was a limitation of his. I wonder where he would find the humanity in some of the events of today as well, you know.
Can I want to say something just very quickly and sort of building on that, but I think, and maybe this is now segueing into the next part of the event. But for me, one of the really extraordinary things about Ed, and I will call him Ed now and not Ed Brunner or Brunner, but Ed, is that he was someone who really invested in scholars who he saw as not quite his students, but as colleagues that were of a younger generation. And he would, he really would nurture scholars who were sort of coming up after him in such a way that I think there's quite a few of us who felt that he was a mentor in a very real way, even though we didn't ever study with him. And David Picard just posted a comment in the Q&A that says that he and Mike Robinson published a book on emotions in tourism, and it's called Emotion in Motion, to go back to our earlier discussion of emotions. And it reminded me, David is another one of these people who really came to work closely with Ed in various kinds of ways that is this sort of mentoring relationship. And as I say, a lot of us have had that with him. But I think that's part of where Ed is going next, is he was so encouraging and so engaged with other people's work and so enthusiastic about continuing to participate in scholarly exchange that he sort of created, I think, an ongoing community of scholars that are continuing to challenge and debate and push forward his ideas or his approach in new and different ways. Maybe we disagree with him, maybe we agree and just want to take it further, but that's my sort of sentimental way of thinking about that question.
Thank you. So we're going to move into the next part, and this I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody's questions, but we will definitely stay as long as we want to offer a few words about Ed for anybody who would like to, and then at the end I'm going to ask his wife Cookie and his grandson Cole, who would like to thank everybody for coming as well. So please, just there's a button with a hand raised button, and if you do that, we will unmute you and do it that. But Walt has to go, and Walt is the only one, the contributor of this volume, that actually is a student, a real, not just mentored, but a student of Ed's. Walt, are you still there that you can start us off?
Yeah, hi, Michael. Yeah, thank you. I'm department chair, and I have a meeting at 1 o'clock that I have to run. So unfortunately, I can't stick around. If you keep talking for a couple of hours, I'll try to wrap the meeting up quick and come back and join you. No, I had Ed as a grad student. I went there not realizing he was near the end of his kind of official term as a professor to study with him. And it wasn't about tourism, it was about his work on identity and performance and things that he was at that time a lot better known. Kathleen Adams and I have talked about this in the past. And the thing about Ed was that he was always questioning things, right? And to return to kind of my chapter on authenticity, this is a chapter, if I could have picked anything to write about, I wouldn't have written about that. And partly because of the way Ed talked about authenticity. You know, he really pushed against what he considered a very elitist orientation. Authenticity was determined by experts, and they may be a museum person or a collector or, you know, anybody that was an expert. And he just thought that was just the wrong way to go about it. And that's really how this notion of co-produced authenticity came about. You know, and this probably, you can see the influence of symbolic interactionism in this, the influence of performative studies and the dynamics that come into these social spaces. And so it's like, you can't have authenticity without all these different people participating in it together. And and he focused on tourists and the kind of pushback from tourists and the ways they interpreted things. And I thought, well, you know, my research was inspired by him, but I was interested in what the people who were giving the tours and the people who were creating the material and social and cultural things that tourists wanted to see. And it's like, well, what do they think? And how do they do that? And so I went back to that and I approached the whole topic of authenticity from that. And, you know, and fortunately I didn't have as many conversations with Ed after I wrote the chapter as I wished that I had, to kind of see what his, you know, kind of what he thought about that take on it. For, you know, most of grad school, he was fairly dismissive of the term, you know, and you know, said, "What's whatever, you know, whatever you make it is, whatever you want it to be, you know, that's authenticity." And no one could challenge that. You know, it's like kind of to put these experts in their place, diminish their role in the process. And that's kind of why I didn't actually want to write about authenticity. But I'm glad that Naomi especially kind of pushed me in that direction. It was a real challenge to kind of revisit my field work and really think about the ways that Maya weavers and artisans and vendors thought about the term in Guatemala. I can't say enough about, you know, Ed as a mentor and as a professor, and he's really good. If he became invested in your project, he's stuck with you. And, you know, I was advised, you know, it's the end of his career. He's probably gonna, you know, he's gonna retire. Who knows what he's gonna do? He may be off, you know, in Bali or Sumatra or leading tours in Africa. You can't rely on that at all. And well, you know, I'll take what I can get. And little did I know that what I could get was 20 some more years of interactions with Ed Brunner. And it was a good decision on my part to you know, to go to Illinois and stick it out and have all this. Let's say just one more, just kind of basic remembrance. A lot of us, I made a comment that Naomi responded online to, but Ed warned all of us that we wouldn't get any respect by doing tourism research when we were students. He's like, you know what, maybe you should think of something else. You know, I carved out an area in the beginning of my career that wasn't about tourism. And it was around 2000, even though it was the space that I worked in, but at the AAA meeting in 2000, Bill Wood and I organized a panel on tourism and nation and tourism in the state. And we invited Ed and Banana Jules Rosette, Dean McCannell, Nelson Grayburn, and a couple other people. And we were the junior, you know, just kind of starting out. And Ed pulled us aside and he said, you know what, this group of people you assembled, they have big egos, me too. So if they go over, just get up and tell them to get off. And the thing is, no one went over. It was the most professional, respectful panel I've ever been on. Stayed exactly on the presentation schedule. And it was an amazing experience. We sold out the room. There's so many people there that the fire marshal came and told people to leave during the, so it was like an awesome experience. And it was great to kind of have that moment. And it was the point where I thought, well, all right, now I'm becoming a real anthropologist. And it was key to the kind of professionalization of me, and I think probably a lot of us in that audience. So great experience, and that just, I think, points to the generosity that he had really to the very end of his life. So thanks for having me. Thanks for allowing me to talk a little bit. I'm gonna have to log off and get on to another Zoom, but it's a real honor to be part of this.
Thank you, and thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for heeding the call when Quetzil and I came in. I remember accosting you at the AAAs and asking you to contribute a chapter. So even though it wasn't the topic you would have done, you did a brilliant job of addressing that topic. So thank you.
Thank you.
It's fun. Well, Quetzil told me that I should develop this into a book, right? That was one of your comments early on. And I'm like, I have, when I have time.
I have a book series for you.
Yeah. So maybe when I find the time,
right.
Post being chair or something.
Right.
Anyway, good seeing all of you.
Thank you.
We'll see each other in person before too much longer.
Thank you. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
So we have a couple other memorial. I wanted to also bring in Helene Silverman. Helene, are you there? She's a colleague, of course, a close friend of Ed's as well, that wanted to say something. If you can unmute, you could turn on your mic if you want.
And let me start the video. Actually, this shows me that my Zoom isn't broken. That was my real concern because the screen has looked totally different than it does on other Zooms. So yes, I had the good fortune of being Ed's colleague while he was still employed at the University of Illinois. Before he retired, I was at the time young, and I was doing straight archaeology. I'm trained as an archaeologist. I was doing my thing on the south coast of Peru. And in the early 1990s, as I would see Ed in the hall, I kept making these comments to him about the fact that I was being filmed by documentary filmmakers for programs about the mysteries of ancient Peru and the extraterrestrials on the Nazca lines. And I kept making remarks to him that, oh, Peru bases its identity on the Incas, and Shirley MacLaine was declared persona non grata while I was doing my doctoral field work because of comments she said. And these were a series of conversations in the hall that happened over several years. And after a while of hearing this throughout the early 1990s, Ed said, you know, this is really very interesting. Why don't you study it? And what was involved for me was really a retooling, because even though anthropological archaeologists receive their degrees in anthropology, people like me are much more comfortable talking to a potsherd than talking to people, and to a large degree, potsherds don't nuance or lie. I mean, certainly I can edit myself as I'm saying this about all kinds of different pottery styles, but it's very different living, working with living people. And Ed assumed this role of mentor to me when I began to speak about Cusco and how people in Cusco might create their own identities by reference to the Incas. And this wasn't new. What was new was that Cusco had a dynamic new mayor who was undertaking a major physical rescripting of the built environment by introducing monuments referring to the Incas. He had a very particular discourse. And just as Naomi was saying, and what Walt was saying, he was the one person in the department who actually said, you're not out of your mind to go pursue ethnographic work and to simply change directions, because he said, I've changed my direction multiple times. And I think that's something that's so interesting in the edited volume as a historiography, is seeing Ed's own evolution over time. But I certainly would not have made this dramatic shift from field archaeology to heritage work without Ed's encouragement, because something we only touched on is that tourism studies definitely was a field that can't get no respect, speaking in the present tense, for how it was in the department when I was a young scholar, and Ed was doing this work in the early 1990s, and his colleagues simply didn't get it. And so for me, watching that and shifting gears, post-tenure vote. I think that's something one has to be very careful about. But I'm incredibly grateful to Ed for the mentorship that he gave me in this new research direction. And I really think that the volume is a wonderful tribute to one of the most influential thinkers anthropology ever has had.
Well, thank you so much, Helene. I really appreciate those comments, and I know that even in working on that volume, you know, you were kind of a go-between. Sometimes I'd call you, have you heard from Ed and everything, you know, and he was, I'm sure he loved having your friendship and collegiality.
I certainly valued it immensely. And Cookie, I don't see you, but hello, Cookie.
I'm going to bring her in a little bit.
And I'm going to, oh wait, I'll just wait for Michael because I have to go to a Zoom pretty soon, but I definitely want to hear Michael.
And I don't see anybody else with their hands up. So if anybody wants to say something about Ed, please put the little raise your hand button.
Michael, we have, I think David Picard is still here.
Oh,
he just leave. He had something he wanted to say. And then Shinji Yamashita has written in the chat. So there's a number of people who are posting into the chat window who I think have things that would be really lovely if they leave, that we could read out, or at least just sort of keep an eye on it.
Well, I'm going to bring Shinji in. I think David left, unfortunately.
But Michael's here.
Michael's here. Okay, Michael, do you want to start? Thanks for zooming in.
Sure, I'll be very, very quick because actually I have to go in a moment. But I'm really glad to have this opportunity. First of all, it's great to see all of you, and indeed, what a wonderful tribute this is to Ed. I didn't know Ed as intimately as I think virtually everyone who's spoken did, but in a way that might give you some sense of what an extraordinarily inclusive person he was. I think I had originally written a short paragraph to which Michael has because I wasn't sure I was going to be able to stay on this long, just to save time and recognizing that everybody's, lots of people probably want to come in. Let me just read what I wrote. It speaks a little bit, and I've amplified it a tiny bit. It speaks to something that's already been mentioned, and I think is a very important aspect of Ed's life. And I feel very much about this as I recently retired and now forced to contemplate, I suppose, reluctantly, the whole issue of aging. So this is what I finally ended up with. Ed Brunner was one of those warm, inclusive people who are also dedicated to their work and see no sharp dividing line between anthropology and life. I recall that as he started to feel the weight of aging, he described how he could remain active by accepting that he wouldn't be traveling to distant or difficult places, but could reflect on his and others' work with the advantage of experience, and that perhaps he could contribute in that way. He saw his bodily experience as itself an ethnographically interesting project, which compensated for the chronic loss of physical mobility and robustness. He certainly showed no signs of giving up. He simply transformed himself as experience led the way. It's hard to believe that such a dynamic and engaged friend and colleague is no longer with us, but he has left a lasting memory of affection, good humor, and deep and unselfish engagement. And I think that's really, I don't think I want to say more than that, except to thank you all for contributing in this wonderful way to the perpetuation, not just of his memory, but of the intellectual tradition that he has done so much to create.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. I have to say, since you're on here, there's maybe two, maybe three different highlights of my career. Cooking a rabbit for you in Perugia was one of them, but the other one, but really, one was really being able to sit down for so long with Ed and the patience that he had. And to be honest, he's one of the most humble people that I met, humble academic. And I mean, we both went to University of Chicago, so you can tell how, the pool of humbleness that we have. But no comment. but I mean, he's just going to be sore than me. He was just such a good, patient, humble, decent person. And he never, and in a way, it was almost a struggle to do the interview because he didn't want to talk about himself, you know?
But you know something, Michael, I think that what you just said is very interesting in terms of the comment I made about his attitude to aging, because instead of fighting against it, I mean, he would fight in an argument, for sure. But instead of fighting what he knew was simply a natural process, he embraced it, he owned it. Yeah. And I think that's that attitude to experience, and many of you talked about experience, has been very much of a model for many of us. As I say, I didn't know him personally as well, I think, as many of you did. But for me, that constant self-awareness, which was not self-indulgence. I mean, if you ever wanted an example of somebody who could tell you what reflexivity was without sounding self-indulgent and simply enamored of himself, that was Ed Brunner.
That's true.
Can I jump in to add to that? Because I think it was the late 90s or early 2000s. He came to talk to my students, and while we were visiting and eating Indian food, he said, I'm sending you a piece I wrote. I don't know if it was ever published, but it was 50 years of going to the AAA meetings, AAA anthropology meetings. And I know it circulated. He shared it with a lot of us. And I found it one of the most insightful pieces about our tribal rituals and the way in which one moves at different stages in one's life through the AAA, to the point where I kind of think of it as my roadmap now for what to expect. And you know, he's left quite a legacy in so many ways on that personal dimension and intellectually. So I'll stop here.
No, thank you. Shinji. Yeah.
I have known Professor Edo Brunner as a famous Indonesianist because I have also studied Indonesia. Particularly when I wrote a book, Bruner and Beyond, I was greatly influenced by his discussion on the ethnography of tourism, the dynamic relationship between anthropology, tourism, and culture, and narratives and meta-narratives of tourists and anthropologists. I came across to see Edo at a AAA meeting in early 2000. I was very impressed his earnestness, sitting at the front of the room to listen to the presentation, although he was already a big name researcher. I felt he is a real scholar. Now, I think he is enjoying a pleasant journey in heaven. I pray for his happiness in the next world. Gobe fuku o inori shimasu in Japanese.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Rob Gordon would like to, oh, sorry, Kathleen, did you want to say something? Oh, Rob Gordon would like to say something as well. Are you there? While he's trying to get on, Tazim Jamal had to leave, but she wanted to say, she'd like to add a brief acknowledgement. Ed Brunner was a major influence on my understanding of tourism during grad school, and I continue to use his work through academic life, including co-authored articles, Tourism in Ghana and Messiah on the Lawn, in class to foster lively discussion of the intersections and recursive relationship between tourism and post-colonialism, etc. Tourism and anthropology continue to be a major influence on the knowledge base in tourism studies, and I look forward to seeing the discussion progress from humanistic perspectives to perhaps greater post-humanistic explorations, among others, in the COVID era. Thank you all. Stay safe and well, Tazim. And of course, Tazim is a great interdisciplinary tourism scholar, so it does show the reach beyond just anthropology that he had. Rob, thanks for coming.
Well, thank you for reminding me how fortunate I was to study with Ed.
Yeah.
I first encountered him in the late 60s in the USIS Information Office in Cape Town, where, sorry, my voice is going, where I was given a book which the Voice of America had published on anthropology, and there was a picture that Ed gave a lecture on psychological anthropology, and at the back there was a photograph of Ed. He had a modified crew cut and he was smoking a pipe. Then in the early 70s, I went to Illinois, and one of the first courses I took was with Ed on social organization. And in fact, the only book I've kept from my graduate days was one of his prescribed texts. There were two which I remember. One was Anthony Wallace, Culture and Personality, and the other was Victor Turner's Ritual Process. And I looked at it, I still have it. Where is it? Here it is. You can see it's battered. And in it, I've got a footnote. Ed says this is important. And then later on, I've done a biography of Max Gluckman. I had the privilege of reading Victor Turner's correspondence with Max Gluckman, and you could just see the energy between Ed and Victor Turner. And then later on, as Quetzil knows, we did a session on Tarzan was an eco-tourist, and Ed was a discussant. And it was one of the highlights of going to the AAA. I mean, he was just absolutely, as you say, totally modest, but a total mensch. And I could tell you stories about his student, Parsudi Suparlan, too, and playing poker with Ed once. But that's probably not fit for polite company. Thanks.
Actually, that's funny you said that. Paul Stoller, my colleague, also said he was definitely a mensch. That was a great.
He was completely.
Thank you for that. Are there other? Am I missing people? Is there anybody else? Quetzil or Kathleen, do you want to mention something? I'm going to try to pull up Elaine. Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody, too, for coming out here. I know we've gone long. Hopefully, we were able to do something fitting for Ed. I mean, we didn't plan to have this correspond or coincide with his passing, but in a way, I'm glad that we have this now so that we can properly remember him. And here's Cookie and Cole. Hi, everyone.
Hi, it's wonderful here. Ed would have loved every minute of this. It's so special hearing, and also hearing with another voice, because I accompanied him in all of these adventures, and especially in Indonesia, where I spoke the local language, the Batak language. And one exciting thing for me was that starting with the Native Americans, they couldn't adopt a man into their culture, into the places we've lived, but they could all adopt women. And these days, there would have been a lot of questions about that. Mm-hmm. So I was always, I think Saul Tax at the University of Chicago was one of the first that questioned why we had to donate one horse. And the University of Chicago paid for one horse.
It's really interesting. And that really does bring up a point that we obviously didn't talk about in this entire thing, is the role of family, of partners, of people that you're close to beyond the ethnographic proximity, and also the impact of the travel and the kinds of, I mean, we anthropologists are kind of weird people, you know, we're traveling, we're mobile typically. And what effect does that have on your children, on your grandchildren, on your partners, as well?
Well, I would like to say,
yeah,
you know, he taught me many things, but one of the things was to question everything in life. And so it was just super awesome to be able to hear you guys speak about your work together and your discoveries and your experiences. I haven't heard about a lot of these things, so it was just an amazing experience for me. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Thank you.
I'd like to say something, and because we're so fortunate to have some of Ed's family here. One of the things that I found really disarming about Ed was how how important relationships were to him beyond the purely intellectual. And one of my favorite memories of him is that he announced to me in an email once, after I very timidly sent him an article I'd written, he responded saying, "I have decided to adopt you." And it was just so kind and so sweet. And when I read, well, when we interviewed him, and then reading the transcript of the interview where he talked about how you traveled together and how you were adopted into groups that you were doing fieldwork with, that these kinds of relationships, in my understanding, he seemed happy to kind of build family upon family upon family in ways both clearly fictive and relatively narrowly, circumscribed, but then also very deep with the kinds of relationships that you had with families in Indonesia across generations. And I wonder if you would be willing to just tell us a little bit about what that was like for you when you went, for example, when you went back in the mid-90s to Indonesia and had that experience of coming back as kin, and what that was like, and bringing your children as well.
There were quite a number of celebrations with our return, and I was with my daughter Jane and her then husband Cole. Blair, sorry. Cole is here sitting with me. They asked what we thought of the changes they had made in the villages, and also the changes in their culture. And we saw the changes in the villages, but we spent quite a long time afterwards talking with Ed about there really weren't the changes in the culture that they saw that we didn't see. And this was between them. What they were seeing were pathways leading to the houses that we had to go through streams and cross to get to. They were seeing a coffee shop that they had built. And when they brought up the relationships we'd had with them in the family, we didn't see any changes. So even after that, it was just a kind of wonderful experience. And they reminisced about their personal times, and having read The Missing Cans of Chicken. I don't know if anybody remembered that, but they remembered these encounters with us. We saw our then Polaroid pictures that had not faded up on their walls. And they had the memories of us as if 30 years hadn't passed. So
it was mutual, this kind of ongoing connections and the feeling of affection.
We had quite a number of connections when students from the area came to the US, and they were talking about, we're going to be in Nebraska and we'll drop in some weekend. I mean, the kind of they hadn't quite gotten the idea of the size of what the United States was going to be. And we had a number of the students that Ed influenced that got PhDs at the University of Illinois. We liked that. Well, started at Yale and then at University of Illinois, and kept us in their loop all these years. And to see pictures from the village again with our pictures wrapped in shawls from ceremonies brought back some wonderful memories. Yeah.
Can I ask, have you have people in the field sites like in Indonesia, have they written to you? Or did they hear the news?
It lasted about, not a current, but it lasted about maybe about 20 years. Mm-hmm. And then the new generations just had it in their lore. There's one couple that are retired in Loma Linda, California, and I don't know if they're seeing this, but they were quite religious at that time, and they are still quite religious, and they contact us. Mm-hmm. And they start talking to me in Batak and to Ed in Indonesian.
That's great. Maybe one more question. Since you're here, we might as well ask you too. I mean, so you heard us talk a lot with lots of theories, very whatever, all these anthropological jargon and everything. For both of you, Cole too. What do you think, or what do you want the legacy of Ed to be?
Well, one, he would have been very adamant that his name be pronounced with a run in it.
That's right. That's
Brunner.
Brunner.
And through the years, it's become Brunner. That was probably Grandpa's German background, but he was very proud of that name. I think he would have been humble hearing about these things and also smiling at people's memories of him.
To continue to preserve the study of culture and make new discoveries and encounters.
And our grandson Cole lived for quite a time in Colombia.
Very cool.
Going to school, and got some wonderful cultural understandings. He was studying Spanish, and in his classes, he had people from China and other places. And they had told us when we were paying for the school that the language that the student would acquire would depend on if they were using it outside of school. And Cole's friends, since he's interested in jewelry and jewelry making, were from other places, including Hong Kong. So I think the language communication was always English.
Yeah.
We have a comment that Quetzil wanted to say to you, Elaine or Cookie, but he's no longer a panelist, so he can't speak.
He left.
He says, Elaine, I unfortunately have to be a silent attendee, but I want to share with you my deepest regards for your and your family's loss. He was a very special man and scholar. I had only a few interactions and opportunities to speak with him at the AAAs. I always found him to be a treasure of a person and mentor. I'm sure he will live on in all of your family. Best wishes.
Oh, that's just
There he is. He's coming back now, after I've just read it for him.
Oh, that's kind of very special. We were grateful that he lived just 2 months short of 96. And especially outstanding was he always went through papers with me, and I read them version after version. But he worked very hard on the Aging Anthropologist and that meeting in Washington. Was that in no, I forget one. He had a standing ovation.
Washington. It was one of those, I think.
He had a standing ovation, and he talked about that for a long time. So I'm grateful to hear from his colleagues and others who made comments. It's very special for us. Thanks.
We should stress that he did get to see the book, and in fact, there is a chapter in the book there are his reflections on the main substantive chapters in the book. So this is, although we are only discussing the book now, he was very much part of it all the way through. So for those who haven't yet seen the book, you will get to hear his voice in the reflections chapter where he comments on the chapter.
And I edited, re-edited, and checked. Ed, with all his brilliance, couldn't spell. And actually, one of my colleagues in education decided to make a study of people who couldn't spell. And Ed used to argue there can't be an H in Afghanistan, for example. And what my colleague in education found out, just the very one word for someone's whole career, was that people who couldn't see the words in their head probably couldn't spell well. But spell check came in, so who cared?
Well, thank you. We really appreciate all of your support as well, and Ed's support in the production of this book, of course. And we send all of our condolences. I mean, he meant a lot to all of us in different ways, and we hope that there's that your family and his friends are doing well in this difficult time too. So thank you for all of this.
We have each other, and that's important.
Yeah, thank you.
Could I read something that
Yes.
is his voice? That this is something that David Picard, who had to leave, said. Is just a little anecdote, but I think it's a nice way for us to close. He writes, Ed called me on a satellite phone when I was in Madagascar in the field because I had a question about a reference letter. And the most important thing he said to me was, don't forget to have fun. I think that's lovely. That even in the midst of someone's someone's field work, they're out in the field, he calls them on a satellite phone, and the most important thing he has to say is, be a whole person, have fun.
Yeah. And I think that really does give a good sense too of you know, his kind of ethnography, right? I mean, you embrace it, you become it, you know, you change with the times, you change in your own you know, how you feel. And it is fun. I mean, that's why we all became anthropologists, and we should always, even in this COVID era where we're all stuck here in our offices, hopefully we remember the reasons why we went into it, you know, and for many of us, that was also reading Ed's inspiring work.
I thank everybody for being part of this. I had a memory just came in from University of Chicago in his graduate student days. He wrote a play for the graduate students to perform. And I do remember him saying that the most important anthropology professors he gave names to. Saul Tax was Tax in Action, and Redfield was Milpa Cornfield, and Egan was Fratry Clankin.
He's having fun. Well, we are at 2 hours of this. So I think we are going to sign off now. I see that there were other people who gave some comments that I'm just looking at now. Thank you very much for everybody tuning in, or those who are watching it later. We will be posting this on YouTube. It will also be posted on the book's website at Rowman and Littlefield. So if you Google the title of the book and you look up the Rowman and Littlefield website for webpage for the book, in another week or two they should have it up. We're gonna take a look at this and get it up for you. So thank you very much, and thank you especially to the Brunners, Cookie and Cole. Thank you for being here. And thank you everybody for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you
Very much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.